This week, as is my wont, I was perhaps watching a TikTok or two and came across a woman that I've seen regularly. She's a young mother who likes to talk about family life and what it means to try to raise a family. And she's a number of small children, and she talked and she said, well, I haven't complained about cooking lately. So she told us ahead of time that's what she was going to do, complaining about that task that she has to do so often and how much she does not like cooking dinner for her family, and yet they have to eat. And so she has to go through the planning and making sure she has the right ingredients and thinking about what different people want or like or don't like and putting it all together, and then sitting there waiting, dreading that moment when one of them complains. She said, and that's when I hate them. And she said, it's so hard because it's someone I love, but to dislike them so much, for not appreciating and not understanding all that I went through, something I didn't even want to do. And isn't that a good chunk of our life? As we age and as we move through life, so much of our lives are filled with those things, those tasks, those responsibilities that we would prefer not to have. And yet, there they are. The drudgery each and every day. It's a little bit of what we hear Job speaking of in our first reading. We know Job was suffering greatly, but his words could be any of ours. Is our life on earth nothing more than pressed service, endless drudgery? I love lying in bed. I wonder, when will it be day? And upon rising, when will sunset come? That endless sense of the task after task after task. And it speaks to a kind of depression, which all of us at some point in our life understand. Jesus, in his actions today with the mother-in-law of St. Peter, gives us a kind of answer, but it's not one we would necessarily expect or necessarily even want. They're in Capernaum. Simon Peter's house, I know I've said it before, isn't as far away from the entrance to the synagogue as the back wall of this church. They leave the synagogue, they go in the house, they hear that this woman is down with a fever. And this part we would like, Jesus just reaches down and helps her up. And when the fever left her, she set about waiting on them. She started doing that which she did every day of her life, just going back to the tasks that made up who she was. Not in terms of her essence, but those things she did day in and day out, waiting on others, taking care of other people's needs. And there is a sense that we get through the scriptures today, that much of our life isn't necessarily monotony or drudgery, but much of our life is tied up in those things that we do to make other people's lives better and to meet the needs that we see around us. And that a good chunk of adulthood is simply getting up and going to work. And that isn't a statement about our eternal purpose, but it is a statement about what faithful Christian living might look like. In the television show The Queen, There's a scene between Queen Elizabeth and her mother, the Queen Mother, at the time of John Kennedy's death. And they're watching the television coverage. And the Queen Mother says to Queen Elizabeth, watching Jackie Kennedy in mourning as they take the coffin out of the Air Force One and put it into the hearse, and she's clearly distraught. She said, weren't they in an unhappy marriage? And Queen Elizabeth simply says, yes, but sometimes it takes a greater unhappiness for us to realize how good things really were. After healing all kinds of people of sickness and demons, Jesus does something in our gospel that each of us sometimes have to do. He went off, and in this translation, it's really quite vivid. He went off to a lonely place to pray. He went away by himself, and he sat in the reality of his life. And each of us are sometimes called to go to a lonely place, to take those moments of drudgery and hardship and difficulty and ponder them. Not to stew over them, but to unpack them and to recognize that in them, in those moments where we feel as if none of it matters, that perhaps we are touching the depth of all that does matter. And that in those low moments is the potential to see God's gift and God's grace. It's a potential to recognize that the person of Jesus who walked through our world healing entered into suffering and death and rejuvenated them as well and brought new meaning to hardship. We need to sometimes go to a lonely place. A few months ago, we had at a Taizé prayer service a group of students, Sean's girls, and I so love welcoming young people to the Taizé prayer service because it's an opportunity to experience silence and prayer and beautiful music and dim lights, and to kind of separate from yourself for a while with a lot of other people. But afterwards, I was fascinated to see what struck them most. Was it the beautiful harmonies, the candlelight, and a number of them simply said, the silence. For these 2 long periods of silence we maintain in common are quite stunning. Because in the modern world, especially our young people who didn't have a phone in front of them, didn't have a flickering screen, didn't have some other distraction, they're able to just be and perhaps hear that small, simple voice of God. St. Paul talks about what his role is in the church when he writes to the Corinthians today, and he says, I'm simply doing what I'm supposed to do, what I'm called to do. And each and every one of us in different ways, through the reality of our lives and the situations put before us, are simply called to do what we do, and to do it well, and to do it with God, and to do it with grace, and to recognize that perhaps in just living our lives, even through those moments of hardship, difficulty, drudgery, and even depression, to see that God is there, and God is helping us, and perhaps we are fulfilling in our own simple way the very work of God in our world today.